So welcome to this biology video. This is going to be covering all four sections of chapter 34 in the biology textbook, which is about the endocrine system and reproductive system. So the endocrine system deals with hormones, which are chemical messengers released into one part of the body that travel through the blood to deliver messages to the other parts of the body. Unfortunately, in common use, we tend to refer only to sexual hormones, the ones that begin sending messages during puberty and tend to affect people's emotions and reactions. But in reality, hormones control a lot of bodily functions. Hormones are produced by glands, and there's also similar substances called prostaglandins that are produced in most cells that also can send messages. There's two types of glands. Endocrine glands produce hormones that go directly into the blood, and exocrine glands have ducts that take their secretions either to the digestive system or to the outside of the body. So we will be going over a bunch of the different glands and the hormones that they release, and you'll see how useful hormones are. Target cells are cells that have receptors on their membranes or inside of the cell that allow specific hormones to attach and deliver their message. And be sure that you check out the diagram on page 811 that identifies the functions of major glands in the endocrine system. Some of these are not described later on in the chapter, so don't skip that page. Make sure you read about all of them. We have two categories of hormones. Steroid hormones are a class of hormones derived from cholesterol, and they are able to enter their target cells instead of just attaching to the outside. Once inside the cell, they affect gene expression. So they turn genes on or off, causing pretty dramatic changes. Non-steroid hormones bind to the receptors on the outside of the target cell, and this activates enzymes in the cell that go on and release other messages within the cell. The next section, 34.2, is about glands of the endocrine system. We're going to be going over some of the functions of the major glands. So the pituitary gland controls many body functions, including regulating some other endocrine glands. And it's at the base of the brain. Here's the pituitary. And then also the hypothalamus, which is here, also in the brain. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. It does this with releasing hormones. Those are hormones that go to the pituitary gland and control what the pituitary gland releases. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary controls the rest of the body. Then you also have the pineal gland, which is back here in the brain, which regulates the sleep cycles with a hormone called melatonin. Next major glands are the adrenal glands, which are on the kidneys, and they release hormones that have several functions. Um, aldosterone regulates blood volume and blood pressure. Cortisol controls metabolism of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are released during stress, preparing the body to run or to fight. Specifically, these two hormones make heart rate increase, open air passages water to prepare for faster airflow, and release extra glucose for more energy for the body. The pancreas releases digestive enzymes to help break down food and is responsible for the creation of insulin and glucagon, two hormones that work to regulate the amount of glucose in the blood. Diabetes 1 is a disease that prevents insulin from being created, leading to dangerously high glucose levels in the blood. And diabetes 2 is a disorder in which insulin is produced, but it doesn't bind to receptors, so it can't do its job. The thyroid and parathyroid glands are glands that regulate metabolism and blood calcium levels. And the thymus is important in immune response. In childhood, it releases a hormone that stimulates T cell growth. Ovaries and testes are the body's reproductive glands. They produce gametes, eggs, and sperm, and they also produce the sex hormones. The endocrine system is an important way that the body maintains homeostasis. Feedback loops result in the production of more or less hormones to keep concentrations of various substances within the range that the body needs to function. Okay, the next section is about the reproductive systems. Testosterone and estrogens are both steroid hormones related to sex. Both sexes do have each hormone, but at different levels. Testosterone triggers the male reproductive system to develop in a human embryo, and eventually causes male characteristics to develop. At puberty, the testes begin to produce gametes due to testosterone. Estrogen does the same for females. It triggers reproductive system in embryo and causes female characteristics to develop. And then at puberty, the ovaries begin to produce their gametes, which are the eggs. For both sexes, puberty begins in the brain when two hormones begin to be released. Those hormones are FSH and LH. The release of LH tells the testes to begin producing increased levels of testosterone, and LH and FSH together trigger sperm development. Okay, some of the parts of the male reproductive system. The testes must be descended down into the scrotum because they need to be kept cooler than body temperature so that sperm develop properly. Sperm, which are haploid gametes, are formed in seminiferous tubules in the testes, and then they're released through the vas deferens, a tube that connects to the urethra, and other glands create seminal fluid. And when released, the seminal fluid and the sperm mix together to make semen, which is released from the penis through the urethra. Okay, some parts of the female reproductive system. We have the ovaries, which create the eggs, fallopian tubes, which deliver them to the uterus, which is where the embryo grows, and the cervix is the opening from the uterus to the vagina. Each ovary contains primary follicles, and these follicles are clusters of eggs. They are clusters of cells surrounding a single egg that help it mature. After puberty, each month, a single egg is released from the ovary into the fallopian tubes, which lead to the uterus. The menstrual cycle is controlled by hormones from the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the ovaries themselves. Each cycle, the menstrual cycle, is about 28 days and includes 3 different phases, which we'll talk about. So from days 1 to 12, we're in the follicular phase. And in this phase, the hormones FSH and LH are released. And the main part of this phase is that the follicle around the egg matures and the egg cell grows. More estrogen begins to be released, causing the lining of the uterus to thicken. The next stage is ovulation, which is where the follicle holding the eggs burst open, releasing the egg, and the egg is moved down the fallopian tube toward the uterus. The third phase, from days 16 to 28, is the luteal phase. In this phase, the ruptured follicle turns into a new structure called the corpus luteum, and this releases hormones. It releases estrogen and a lot of progesterone. They're both female sex hormones. The amount of LH and FSH decrease, the amount of estrogen and progesterone increase, and the hormones cause the lining of the uterus to develop more in preparation for pregnancy. If fertilization does not happen, after the 28 days, the cycle begins back into the follicular phase, and at the same time, menstruation is happening. This means the LH and the estrogen levels fall, and the uterine lining loosens and is shed through the vagina, which is commonly called a period. If the egg is fertilized, the state of being pregnant halts the menstrual cycle, so this doesn't happen anymore. The fertilized egg, which is in the fallopian tube, begins dividing and growing into an embryo. And while it's doing that, it moves through the fallopian tube down to the uterus. Quick review question before we go any further. Which two phases of the menstrual cycle happen at the same time? Luteal phase, follicular phase, ovulation, or menstruation? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. Okay, and so as the cycle happens, it's the menstruation and follicular phase that happen at the same time. So in the follicular phase, a new egg is being developed. In ovulation, the egg is released into the fallopian tube. In the luteal phase, the uterus lining is really growing and getting thicker. And then it goes back to both the follicular phase and menstruation at the same time. So in menstruation, the uterus lining is falling off and leaving, and at the same time, a new egg is being prepared in the follicular phase. And though they mostly concern the immune system, the textbook also has a section in this chapter about sexually transmitted diseases. These are either viruses or bacteria that spread from one person to another by sexual contact. Some are examples of viral ones are hepatitis, herpes, genital warts, and HIV. Some bacterial ones are chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis. Some STDs can be life-altering or fatal, so it's important to take precautions against them. And the surest way not to get an STD is to abstain from sex. For people that are having sex, it's important to discuss STD status with potential partners and use condoms to prevent the spread of disease. Section 4 is about fertilization and development of an embryo. So fertilization is the joining of an egg cell with a sperm cell to produce a single diploid cell. So remember, both of those are haploid cells, so they only have one copy of DNA or one set of chromosomes. They combine together to make a diploid cell, so it has two sets of chromosomes. An egg in the fallopian tube is met by a sperm which has swum from the vagina through the cervix, through the uterus, and into the fallopian tube. And the sperm attaches to the egg's outside and releases enzymes that break through the egg's protective layer. The nucleus of the sperm enters the egg so that the chromosomes are brought together. This single-celled fertilized egg is now called a zygote. While in the fallopian tube, the zygote begins to undergo mitosis, which the cells dividing repeatedly to make a multi-celled structure. From this point until the 9th week of pregnancy is called an embryo. After that, it would be called a fetus. Though there are specific names for some of the stages of an embryo. So first it forms a hollow ball called a blastocyst, and the blastocyst attaches to the wall of the uterus and grows into those tissues of the uterus lining, a process called implantation. The cells begin to specialize at this point so that as they continue to divide, they create different tissues. Now we've talked about one egg being fertilized by one sperm, but what happens with twins? Well, with fraternal twins, these are twins that are not exactly alike. They don't have the exact same DNA. And that happens if more than one egg is released by the ovary and they are both fertilized. So we have two examples of fraternal twins here. They can be of the same sex or even different sexes, because it doesn't really matter. You have two separate eggs and two separate sperm. Then there's identical twins. These are twins that share the exact same DNA. And this happens if one egg is fertilized and then the zygote completely replicates, creating two zygotes and two eggs develop. The next big phase in development is gastrulation. This is the name for the process of forming the endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. You might want to review chapter 25.2 about what those three things are. But in general, these are three layers of tissues that will develop into the organ systems. The ectoderm will develop into the skin and nervous system. The mesoderm will develop into bones, muscles, blood, and reproductive organs. And the endoderm will form the inner linings of the digestive, respiratory, and excretory system. Neurulation is the first step in developing the nervous system. Mesoderm tissue forms the notochord, and ectoderm tissue forms the normal cells that will go through several stages to begin forming the brain and spinal cord. Throughout development, the embryo is surrounded by the amniotic sac, which is filled with amniotic fluid that cushions the embryo. The layer outside of the amniotic sac is the chorion, which connects the embryo to the placenta. The placenta is an organ that grows in the uterus with the embryo, connecting the mother and the embryo with veins and arteries. It allows the mother's blood to deliver oxygen and nutrients. There we go. It allows the mother's blood to deliver oxygen and nutrients and allows the embryo's blood to get rid of carbon dioxide and waste. Okay, so you can see in this diagram, it is going between the embryo and the mother, and there are veins and arteries going through the placenta. Note that because the blood is shared, the placenta can transmit diseases from the mother to the fetus, and also chemicals such as alcohol, nicotine, heroin, and cocaine can go from the mother's body to the fetus. After about 8 weeks, most of the organs have begun to develop, and the growing child is referred to as a fetus rather than an embryo. The organs are developed by 3 months, but they're not ready to function to survive outside yet. From 4 months to 6 months, the fetal tissues continue to specialize and begin to function. And then in months 7 through 9, the organ systems fully mature. During this time, the fetus doubles in weight and can regulate its own body temperature, and the organ systems are preparing for life after birth. They're getting ready to take over. The lungs and central nervous system are some of the last things to fully develop, so babies born prematurely often have breathing problems. Childbirth is a process triggered by hormones. Hormones start the contractions and open the cervix. The amniotic sac then breaks open and fluid escapes through the vagina. And then the baby is forced out by the contractions, and then the placenta is forced out. Hormones signal the mother's body to begin producing milk in the breasts. And that was just a quick overview of the growth and development part, and that brings us to the end of this chapter. If you do have any more questions, don't hesitate to contact an instructor.